and good evening to all of our participants who may be joining us either by registering through the link or joining us in the virtual world on Facebook Live. Thank you for being here tonight. My name is Tiana Hercules, and I am extremely honored to be here tonight to moderate this important and informative panel discussing the issue of the racial wealth gap in Connecticut in a proposed House Bill 6267, a bill to form a racial justice task force. Now, because I am in my professional life an employee of the state, I promised my boss I'd give a little disclaimer before kicking things off that any of the views or opinions expressed tonight by myself are my own personal views and not those of the Office of the Public Defender. However, I really am looking forward to this discussion. So tonight we will hear from an illustrious panel of political activists, social justice warriors, and academics, all who bring their expertise in a unique perspective around the causes and consequences of the racial wealth gap here in Connecticut and how we solve this disparity through policy solutions. So to introduce our panel briefly, we are joined here tonight by State Representative Anthony Nolan, who is a representative in Connecticut's 39th district, and he is a sponsor of the HB-6267 that we're going to be discussing tonight. Also joining us, and I don't think he's on the line yet, but he will be here shortly, is Dr. William Sandy Darity, who is a Samuel Du Bois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African and American Studies and Economics, and the director of the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke University, and co-author of an amazing book, From Here to Equality. We are also joined by Dr. Thomas Craemer, who is an associate professor at the Department of Public Policy in our very own University of Connecticut. And last but certainly not least, Seanice Austin, who is a community and political activist here in Connecticut, New London resident, Director of Diversity and Inclusion at the School of Business at the University of Connecticut. So again, we thank our panelists for joining us this evening, and we really look forward to their insight and what they have to say about this important issue of the racial wealth disparity here in Connecticut and talking about proposed House Bill 6267. To set the tone for this evening, we're gonna have a short film that's gonna kick us off to kind of set the stage for the issue that we're talking about today.
White families in America hold almost 10 times the wealth of Black families. To put that into perspective, the median net worth for white families is upwards of $172,000, compared to just $17,000 for Black families. In a country with a staggering level of wealth inequality, Connecticut has one of the highest wealth gaps in the nation. We have to not only ask ourselves why, but be willing to fight to right the wrongs of the past that have led to this bleak future for Black American descendants of slavery. America's past of chattel slavery, brutal terrorism, state and federally sanctioned discrimination and segregation was not reserved for the South alone. While Connecticut passed a gradual emancipation law in 1784, it would not be until 1848 that the last slave was held. After the Civil War, reparations and reconstruction was promised to America's freedmen. Unfortunately, it was never delivered. What followed was Jim Crow, lynchings, mass incarceration, denied voting rights, housing discrimination, job discrimination, redlining, educational disparities, and the list goes on. Connecticut was no exception to the continued oppression piled onto descendants of slavery. Redlining was used to force Black Americans into certain neighborhoods and keep them out of others. This was a key factor in solidifying the wealth disparity that exists today. Educational disparities still plague the state now, as well as bias in policing and hiring. None of these systemic issues are isolated. They all stem from America's original sin. Let's do our part in righting the wrongs, in doing so with intentionality and specificity. Tell your representative to support House Bill 6267. It's time to make amends for America's original sin.
Thank you. That short clip starts off with some gripping statistics. $172,000, upwards of $172,000 represents white wealth in America. $17,000 represents that of Blacks. So when we look at this vast and staggering inequality between white wealth and Black wealth, we know that these disparities extend to many areas in society. They extend to poor health outcomes for Blacks, the disparities in homeownership, the disparities in educational outcome, the size and obviously people's wallets and ultimately their bank accounts in the neighborhoods that we live in. What in your perspective contributes to these gaps? And so this is our kind of kickoff question for all of our panelists and whomever wants to start with this, really looking at where we are now in the social historical context and how we got here today.
So thank you, Tiana. If you don't mind, I'd like to start off with that question. Where we are today has how we got where we are today is very much rooted in the history of America and Connecticut's involvement in slavery and the slave trade. And that's something that is not often discussed. We cannot talk about where we are today without studying where we came from. So I wanted to share a little bit about Connecticut's slave history with the participants, with the audience, because oftentimes this is not something that is widely known. Connecticut had more enslaved Africans than any other state in New England. At the Civil War, when the Civil War started, there were approximately 6,400 slaves in the state of Connecticut. New London, my home city, had the largest number of enslaved people. Slavery continued in Connecticut with slave ships docking in both Middletown and in New London. There are records of slave ships coming in and slaves being sold on our shores. Slavery was practiced in Connecticut up until 1848. And I think, part of the importance of us addressing these disparities is really educating the public and understanding where we were and how we got here today. There needs to be some intentionality around our efforts to address the racial wealth gap, the same way that there was intentionality that created the disparities.
Thank you, Seanice. Dr. Craemer,
Yes,
would you like to add to that, please, with respect to the historical aspect of how we got here today? Oftentimes, actually read an article today that was very timely in the current, talking about segregation in Connecticut, looking at the suburbs of West Hartford in Bloomfield. And it definitely hit on some of the policies and practices such as redlining and things of that nature that resulted in what we see today. But would you touch upon kind of piggybacking off of Seanice, some of the historical aspects even prior to those policies?
Yes, thank you. I would not limit it to Connecticut, although this is the focus of the bill, but it's really an American legacy. I think there is no mystery how the gaps evolve if you think about many, many generations, even before the United States, of enslavement, which means that the wealth produced is taken out of African-American hands and placed into white hands, and inheritances are then made from one generation to the next, incurring compound interest and growing exponentially. But in the hands of those whose ancestors did not do the hard work, whereas those whose ancestors did do the hard work are excluded from those benefits to this day, based on a part of the Constitution that we no longer consider constitutional today, which is the idea that that there are persons held to service or labor, which was the way the Constitution circumscribed enslavement. Based on this, now no longer a valid law, descendants of enslaved African Americans today are not entitled to inherit the intergenerational wealth that was produced at the time. So that to me seems like an injustice that is a present day injustice, not a past injustice, that is calling out for a solution.
Yes, thank you. And we are definitely going to be talking about some of those solutions today. Representative Nolan, obviously when you hear Seanice speak on Connecticut's role in Connecticut having the highest number of enslaved peoples, stolen peoples, Blacks in New England, and then New London, my hometown as well, having the highest number. Do you believe this creates a moral imperative for Connecticut to be a leader in righting this wrong and in making amends for this original sin?
I do. I think that Connecticut has a great opportunity, especially in this session, to fix some of those wrongs and make them right in regards to the things that the inequalities and the economic injustices throughout Connecticut. There was a lot of wrongs, of course, that back in the day that led to how it is today, but we have an opportunity this month and then again later on in the year to make some adjustments, some major adjustments, not just to say that we're going to make sure from this day forward that everything's going to be equal. But sometimes being equal means that those that were getting so much for so long are going to have to stop getting, so that those who were not getting can catch up and can maintain a decent standard of living for now, because we have to be given that decent standard of living before we can excel to the next stage or next standard of living in order to make sure that the equality and inequalities are fixed. This month, legislation has a great opportunity, one, to pass this bill for the task force. And we want to make sure that everybody understands that this bill is for a task force. It's not for the reparations itself right now. It is a task force to investigate the things that our government did wrong to Black folk a long time ago and make sure that they acknowledge it, and also that they start fixing it so that there is equality in the things that the bill is going to be looking for. And I'm sure that we're going to talk about those, what is it? I think it's about 12 things that we're going to talk about to make sure that people understand the things that we're trying to get looked at in regards to this. So we got a lot of catch up to do. And I will say one of my fears is that people don't want to be always educated so they can understand. They automatically want to shun what's going to happen. And I hope you understood that, what's going to happen, because it's going to come around to where the equality has to level out. Because if it doesn't level out, what will happen when we do, or we're able to gain the momentum, those who didn't join the journey that we're trying to get to, you're what about being treated the same? What nobody wants to be treated like people were treated a long time ago. And I really don't believe that Black folk would even go to that level, but I just hope that everybody understands that being kept behind when it comes to economics and injustice is not a fun thing. And we just hope that we can move forward and make the changes that we need to make.
Tiana, if you don't mind, if I can chime in really quickly, because I think it's important that the participants get an understanding of the data. Oftentimes, when we hear from political leaders or even individuals in the community, we talk about these issues, but we don't talk about the data. And one of the things that Political Action CT and all the different individuals and organizations that we work with are focused on is looking at the data. So if you don't mind, if we could bring up the PowerPoint that specifically talks about Connecticut. I just want to kind of go through it really quickly with the participants, if someone can bring that up on the screen. So what we're looking at here is just an overview of Connecticut. Some of the Connecticut's population, Black people comprise about 10% of the population here in Connecticut, which is very equivalent to our population in America as a whole. So Connecticut is a very much a case study, a great case study as we look at reparations, or we talk about this on a national level. If we can go to the next slide. This for me was very enlightening, and I think I hope that others find it to be the same as well. This is the Black business values by race in Connecticut. Black businesses are valued at about $58,000, and when we see where other businesses in the state are valued. So when we talk about opening up new businesses in the state without looking at what those businesses are worth and the types of businesses, we're not really getting the full picture. So we need to understand that even though there are businesses, Black-owned businesses in Connecticut, what those businesses are worth is not on par with white Americans and even some of the other ethnic groups that are here in the state. We go to the next slide. And this is talking about home ownership. We often hear that home ownership is the path to closing the racial wealth gap. And that's a myth as well. As we can see the numbers here in terms of home ownership, you cannot purchase a home, maintain a home, unless you have economic parity. And we'll talk a little bit more. Hopefully Dr. Darity will be able to join us because he has done some great research around understanding and myths about the racial wealth gap. The last slide that we'll progress to is one that talks about households with a zero net worth. And again, this is something where we see Black Americans are also lagging in this area. And part of the study and the importance of having the bill is we want to study why and understand why these disparities exist, specifically amongst African Americans, those who descend from slavery, because we have been in this country since its inception, yet we continue to lag economically. And we know why, and we need to have some studies on why that is, and then fix that and repair that through reparations. So again, I just wanted to share that with the audience. We can go back to full panel.
Thank you, Seanice. Data is always very powerful. And I think especially when we're talking about something that has such economic implications, because I think it's easy for some to think that we are in a transracial America. You know, you see we have Black president, now a Black vice president, and people think that things are equal if you are living in your silo and not acutely aware of what the numbers say in terms of outcomes for Black Americans in this country. And so, Dr. Craemer, when we think about numbers and we think about hundreds of years of free labor that built this country, and then followed by systemic policies that excluded Black people from economic opportunities, and now where we are today, how do we come to arrive at putting a price tag on that labor? I believe in some of your research, you quoted a number around $14 trillion would be what it would be to compensate reparation payments for Black descendants of slavery. How did you arrive at that, and how do you go about articulating and communicating that number that some people probably can't even wrap their heads around?
Right, it's a staggering number. It was in 2009, when this number refers to, it was about 1 year's worth of the US GDP. By now, this number has grown, and it would be like 18 or 20, between 18 and 20 trillion dollars, still roughly one year's worth of the US GDP. That's just mind-boggling. Now, I have to say that this was a very conservative estimate. So it excludes colonial slavery. It excludes discrimination after slavery. It only looks at what wages were not paid to African Americans, and it uses a very conservative interest rate, only 3% to compound it up to today. So that barely makes up for inflation. The way I arrived at this estimate was that I took the census information about the enslaved population, and that information is available from the first census in 1790 all the way to 1860, which is the last census before the Civil War. So it omits the Civil War years, which is another reason it's a conservative estimate. And then I multiplied that number of enslaved people by the number of hours that were available in the year. They were on the clock for 24 hours of the day, 365 days of the year. I took the entire day because there was no laws that limited work to the daytime hours. And rest was only given as part of the slave owners' consideration and profitability, not for the enslaved people to decide in a free market sense. So I took the typical hourly wage at the time for unskilled labor. I took unskilled labor, which is a conservative assumption, again, because many of the enslaved people were skilled. But I found historical data on unskilled hourly wages from 1790 on till 1860. And I multiplied those, and the wages at the time were puny. They were like 2 cents an hour in 1790. It rose to 8 cents per hour in 1860. So it was really not very much. This is another reason this estimate is conservative. And then adding it all up and, of course, estimating the number of enslaved people in the years from 1776 to 1790 from the census information. Long story short, the compounded total added up to $14.5 trillion in 2009 dollars, and would now be almost $20 trillion. So it's a very conservative estimate, but it's a huge number. I think what for me the interesting part about it is it's not an infinite number. People often think, oh, we can't possibly tackle reparations because it's infinite, and technically it is, because you cannot put a price tag on a life, on freedom taken away. You cannot retrospectively restore that. What you can do is a symbolic gesture, and that would be reinstating those inheritances that were lost. That is one way how it could be done. And of course, it's up to negotiations between the descendant community and the federal government, or whatever government unit is concerned, to work out whether the whole outstanding debt is paid or only a portion. But I should also mention that the actual estimate is very sensitive to the interest rate you choose. So I picked only 3%, which is very low. At 6%, the amount explodes into the quadrillions. So this is why Professor Darity and I and a number of other activists basically say, well, we could say the minimum goal should be that the racial wealth gap be closed through the reparations procedure. And that would take about 14 or 15 trillion dollars, and that is actually doable. So, yes.
Thank you for providing that context. And just as a brief follow-up, because you mentioned kind of the response that it can't be done, looking at the numbers. But the truth of the matter is that we have proof or data in history where America has made amends for past wrongs in the form of a monetary contribution or a monetary compensation to different groups. The Japanese being one of the most that sticks out. So outside of breaking down the numbers and the fact that it is, it is a reality or it is obtainable, how else do you respond to those arguments that that it can't be done?
Well, I would say it has been done a couple of times in history all over the world, and for slavery. For example, Haiti paid reparations for the abolition of slavery to France for the loss of their property. And it paid from 1825 all the way to 1947, over hundreds of years. Another example is the British government paid reparations to slave owners for the abolition of slavery in 1833. Those loans that were taken up back then were paid off as recently as 2015. So there was no doubt that generations of British people could be settled with a debt resulting from slavery, as long as the recipients were slave owners or their white descendants. It was not problematic. It becomes more problematic when the recipients are African-American descendants of the enslaved. So I should say in this context also that the United States government paid reparations to slave owners in Washington, D.C. during the Civil War in 1862, when slavery was abolished there. And they paid those reparations at the height of the Civil War, when every penny counted for the preservation of the Union. So I think those precedents are important to see that payments could be made under difficult circumstances. And it's just a question of whether we view the recipients as worthy of receiving those reparations. And I think that's a very important consideration.
And I greatly appreciate you making that point, because that brings me to a question I have for our resident politician on the panel. And I see that we are now joined by Dr. Darity. So thank you for joining us. I'm glad you were able to get in. I'm gonna shoot you a question right after this question to Representative Nolan. So one of the things that Dr. Craemer touched on or hit on in his comments was political will, and that it can be done if the recipients are deemed worthy and if the leadership and the political will exists to get it done. And so one of the things I often hear in different circles in the state when it comes to poor people, Black people in this state, is that there really is no one speaking up for them in these backdoor conversations. And so what is your temperature on the political will as it exists currently to really close the racial wealth gap in our state?
That I don't think that this is really the for the politicians. I think the people are going to have to speak loud enough for them to listen and understand that they need to make the changes that are necessary to make to create the equalities that are needed. A great example of that was the police accountability bill, and how many thousands of people came out in different districts to stand for the fact that issue needed to be dealt with. And it's almost like the same thing has to take place. People have to come out and tell the politicians, us, that this is what we want to happen. This is what we need done. And you voted to keep me in the office. I had numerous conversations with Seanice, and even I think we talked about reparations prior to me getting elected, if I'm not mistaken. And then I attended a couple of things that she had. My issue is I didn't understand as much as I needed to understand. And I had to learn the little bit that I do know. And I don't even think I know enough right now And I know myself, I need to learn more and educate myself more in regards to um, a lot of the things that happened to Black Americans back in the day that I wasn't taught in school. But back to the topic is we need for everybody to reach out to your political leadership. And that doesn't stop with legislation. It starts in New London also, in our own hometowns, so that they understand how serious it is to start making the changes in the municipalities, um, and the state legislation. So um, I believe that a lot of people are willing to support this bill. But I also believe that a lot of people are scared to tell a lot of people that they're going to support this bill. And I also believe that there are people that are going to sign on the bill, that are signing on the bill because they're scared of what people are going to say if they don't. Um, so I don't, you know, I'm so proud of Seanice coming to me and waking me up in regards to something like this, and she put it in my hands, and I was ecstatic when this bill got a bill number, um, because of the hesitation of a lot of people that I know are up in Hartford. So we have to push hard, and hearing Shanice talk about Dr. Darity, man, um, I'm just glad to be on the same Zoom as him right now. Just hearing the education that she's taken on from him and trickled down to me. So I'm ready to see this move, and I'm going to stop talking because I'm going elsewhere. But it's up to the people to get in touch with legislators and make sure that they understand how important this is to them.
Thank you. And so just to echo that for those who are watching us either on the Facebook Live or are registered on the link and listening in, power always resides with the people. And so that is why this panel is so important, because it is trying to break down a very complex issue that can sometimes seem overwhelming, because you do need to have an understanding of the historical, social historical context and how it impacts the things that we are seeing today when it comes to the issue of the racial wealth gap. But it's not insurmountable. And the more folks that are behind pushing for national reparations, the more of a possibility it becomes. So I appreciate those comments greatly, Representative Nolan.
Tiana,
Going over.
if I could just mention again, I just think it's so important for us to stress that it's a task force, so that because it's going to take the federal government to do the biggest things that we need done, but locally through education, do this through uh, equality when it comes to jobs, especially contracts with the state. Um, we can do this through healthcare and making sure that everybody has equal healthcare in the state. So there's a lot of things that the legislation is looking at as far as bills, and I'll share those with Shanice so she can put them out there on that we really need people to pay attention to. That will help a little bit more.
Thank you. So going now to Dr. Darity, and again, thank you for joining us. I'm going to ask you a two-part question because I do understand that your time is limited with us. So I'm going to ask you two questions in one, if you don't mind. So the first part, before you joined, we were talking a bit about the social historical context with respect to slavery and the policies that came thereafter that resulted in the racial the wealth gap that we see today. So in your opinion and in your perspective and based on your knowledge and expertise, why is it critical for people to really understand the connection between the transatlantic slave trade and the racial wealth gap that exists today? So that's one part of the question. And then the second question, as an economist, what trends have you noticed over the past 5 to 10 years that have contributed or continue to contribute to the widening racial wealth gap? So part historical context and part what policies, practices that are still at play now that are making this gap even further apart.
So first, let me say thank you to you and to Seanice and to Representative Nolan and my colleague Thomas Craemer for being on this event. And I especially want to say that I think there's a particular wisdom to the approach, the task force approach that Connecticut is pursuing. I've frequently made a distinction that is drawn from Malcolm X. In a situation in which somebody's plunged a knife into his back, and he made a distinction between pulling the knife out and healing the wound. And the types of practices and policies that Representative Nolan are talking about, from my perspective, are pulling the knife out, which is somewhat different from compensating people for the damages that have been incurred as a consequence of the knife being put into their back. But we need to do both. And at the state and municipal level, there are lots of opportunities to pull the knife out, but it's at the federal level that we need to set up the program of compensation. And that program of compensation should be anchored, I think, and Professor Craemer and I have been involved in trying to assess a variety of ways in which you could measure what the size of the bill is. But in the work that I've done, I've kind of settled on the idea that it should be focused on eliminating racial wealth differences in the United States. So, so that would mean bringing the Black share of wealth, which is now about 2.5%, into strict proportion, at least, to the Black share of the nation's population, which is about 13%. And this would require an expenditure of somewhere in the vicinity of 10 to 12 trillion dollars. And it becomes clear that states and localities can't do that. They can't meet that bill. Their total budgets across the entire United States is about $3.1 trillion. So even if they devoted their entire annual budget to the reparations bill, we would still have a $7 trillion shortfall, and they wouldn't be able to perform any of the services that they are obligated to deliver to their constituents. And so, so it has to be a federal reparations program. Now, why should it be a federal reparations program apart from the fact that the federal government's got the capacity to fund it? Well, it's also a responsibility of the federal government because the federal government's the culpable party. The federal government is the entity that authorized, sanctioned, or looked the other way when a host of atrocities were exercised on Black people in the United States. And so we begin with the transatlantic slave trade, but we also have to take into account nearly 100 years of legal segregation in the United States that was accompanied by wave upon wave of massacres that took place all across the country, white massacres that resulted in the loss of Black lives, and frequently the seizure and appropriation of Black property by the white terrorists. And then that's followed by, in the aftermath of the civil rights legislation, ongoing mass incarceration, police executions of unarmed Blacks, as well as discrimination in housing, credit, and employment markets. And so there's a long period of time in the United States leading up to the present moment that has to be taken into account. And it's my impression that the best expression of the cumulative intergenerational effects of these atrocities on Black economic status is captured by the Black-white difference in wealth. Okay? And so now it becomes imperative to think about what has caused that differential to be what it is. And I would argue it's a consequence of intentional national policies that promoted wealth accumulation on the part of whites and promoted wealth decumulation on the part of Blacks. And we can begin with the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, where the formerly enslaved never received the 40-acre land grants and restitution that they were promised as compensation for their years of bondage. And at the same time, under the aegis of the Homestead Act of 1862, the federal government begins a process of allocating 160-acre land grants to upwards of 1.5 million white families in the United States, with the long-term effect of producing a circumstance where today about 45 million living whites are descendants who have benefited from the allocation of those 160-acre land grants as the nation completed its settler colonial project. And then in the 20th century, there was a shift away from a focus on land as the asset that the federal government was promoting to home ownership. And when the shift was made to focus on home ownership, it was made in a discriminatory fashion. So we can think very specifically about the New Deal legislation that was designed to promote home ownership, as well as the home ownership provisions of the GI Bill. And these were clearly applied in a way in which Blacks were overwhelmingly excluded from those benefits, while whites were given those benefits. And in the present moment, we have to look at the tax code and the tax laws to see who is encouraged to accumulate wealth and whose wealth is most likely to be taken away. And so it's federal policy that produced the racial wealth differential, and it's federal policy that needs to be mobilized to close it. And that should be through a reparations program for Black Americans who are descendants of the persons who were denied the 40 acres in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War.
And if I can jump in, thank you so much, Dr. Darity, for that. And if we look ahead, there is going to be a $30 trillion wealth transfer from baby boomers to the next generation. Baby boomers are getting older, passing away. They are now going to transfer that wealth.
Yeah, I'm one of those baby boomers who will be passing away.
Many of us, those of us descended from slaves, are not going to receive that wealth
Right.
from our parents. And if we don't pass a reparations law at the federal level in a timely manner, we will never be able to close that racial wealth gap. It's going to be a very, very long time. So that's another reason why this is so important that we address this matter now, immediately.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people, folks who talk about buying Black, banking Black, folks who talk about making sure that they're two-parent families and all these sorts of things, who think that those are ways in which the racial wealth differential could actually be closed. But given the existing level of resources in the Black community in the United States, closing the racial wealth gap through autonomous actions that the Black community might take is a sheer impossibility. And so you're absolutely right, with this immense intergenerational transfer that it's already begun, in fact, the racial wealth gap is just going to become explosively larger. And the only way in which we can actually address that is by having a program that is directly attentive to the question of the wealth deprivation of Black Americans who are descendants of U.S. slavery.
Thank you. And that is such an important point, because we are in an age, especially with social media, where you're seeing, millionaires popping up through YouTube and Instagram, and people really have this this skewed notion of how wealth can be attained, like you said, through autonomous action. And that's just not going to move the needle by any stretch of the imagination for Black people as a whole. While it's great to hear those success stories, we cannot be fooled into thinking that that's, that whole bootstrap mentality is what's going to do it, because it's just not. The enormity of this gap is just not going to be eliminated through those acts. So I greatly appreciate that point. So
the best way to have a significant amount of wealth is to have parents and grandparents who had a significant amount of wealth.
Exactly. Generations and generations.
Yeah.
So Representative Nolan, let's try to get down into some of the nitty gritty of of what the proposed bill would do with respect to the task force, because I think it is easy for folks just to hear that word reparations and automatically think, okay, Connecticut's going to start writing checks. We really want folks to understand what the bill's intent is and what the focus areas of the task force ultimately will be if it is passed into law.
So right now, there is a heading to the bill that says the task force to be created is to, one, identify and document the institution of slavery that existed within the country historically, and in particular this state. So we want to find out, we want them to document what was Connecticut's responsibility when it came to that. In 1 second, because I just lost my screen. And the second one is to make recommendations for legislation to reverse existing racial disparities that are attributed to ongoing state policies and practices. So, and it basically breaks down the redlining that was just on the screen, and you can put that back up if you want. But those are the things that are actually in the task force heading. Now, being in the bill as is, the bill will be reevaluated as it goes through a process, and it gets a hearing. And we have to still push for it to have a hearing because it hasn't been selected for a hearing yet. So number 4, reverse the existing racial disparities. We talked about, I said that already. Design a plan for the state to support enactment of a federal project of reparations for all American descendants of the chattel slavery, and submit a written report of its findings and recommendations to the General Assembly. Now, those are the things that those were the highlights of the information that myself and Seanice first talked about in a draft that she sent that went along with the bill. And what they did when they were trying to give the bill a number, they could only put so much on it in the beginning, and then what they'll do is, as it goes through the process, it will be determined how the whole bill will be written, and that's when that's where the hearing will mean a lot, because there will be gained from the hearing along with those that are going to be preparing it, besides what was submitted.
Tiana, do you mind if I add some additional information too about the bill?
Please do. Thank you.
Thank you, State Rep Nolan. This bill, the proposal that I shared with State Rep Nolan was developed by a bunch of hardworking people that put a lot of time and effort into creating the proposal. Jonathan Bryant, Antonia Edwards, James Keat, Thomas Craemer, Professor Craemer, and Dr. Darity were all involved in creating this 10-page document that we then shared. State Rep Nolan gave a great synopsis of the highlights of the proposal. Some of the key things, the 3 key things that we're asking for is, again, for the task force to be created to study these 12 specific items as it relates to the descendants of the Black American descendants of slavery. How are these issues today impacted on this specific group? The second thing is to identify Black American descendants of slaves as a separate racial group, or being able to identify them as a cultural group on every legal document. We say Black people and African Americans, and that term is widely utilized. Those of us who descend from slavery is a very unique group here in America, and we do not have a count. We don't know that number. We need to start. Start enumerating that number, and we have to do that in order to really put a real framework around the number of reparations, and really start dialing in and honing in on what those numbers will look like. And then the third thing that we're asking for is for the state of Connecticut to really come out in full force in supporting reparations at the federal level. I believe that, and we all believe, those of us that have worked on this bill, that HB-6267 is going to create a framework for the state of Connecticut in terms of addressing disparities that impact those of us who descend from slavery, as well as disparities that impact minority groups and disadvantaged groups throughout the state. Right now, we operate very disjointed. And this bill is a comprehensive bill that is addressing disparities across a wide range. We want this bill passed in its entirety as it's presented in the proposal. And so we're going to fight for that. And that's where our focus is. So I just wanted to make sure that I share that with the listeners, and because we need you. We need your voices. We need you to join in on this effort. Thank you.
Yeah, and I appreciate you breaking that down, Seanice. And certainly, as we know, especially as Black Americans living in the United States, that there are often areas of division, and some of the feedback or response, or maybe even criticism to reparations initiatives, is that it does carve out or try to specify specifically African descendants of chattel slavery. And while I know why that is important and why my identity as such is unique from someone coming from Caribbean, someone coming from the West Indies, or another part of the world, or diaspora that was involved in slavery, but not American slavery, why I understand why those distinctions are important. Can all of the panelists just share why that's important and why we need to look at that as not a focal point of separation, but really why that specificity is not to divide, but it is to unify? Because I think it is easy to give that criticism like, oh, this is only for specific Black people, but I'm discriminated against. So just weigh in with your opinions, and obviously research as well that speak to that point.
So I'll start off. We really have to move away from the idea that being specific means being divisive. It is not. It is a way for us to hone in and truly address issues. And once we adopt this mentality here in America as we do politics, that not only benefits us, but it also benefits other groups, because it allows us to start really focusing in. Oftentimes politicians like to take the expedient route. They just want to get it done. And you miss people when you do that. There's missed opportunities. So I think, as a collective group, us really focusing on addressing marginalized groups as individuals and not as just a whole conglomerate of people together will allow us to really hone in and address those issues. So I'll start with that, and then I'll let my other panelists comment.
Thank you.
Right. Yeah, I would add to that. I totally agree about the idea that specificity is not a divisive thing. I sometimes hear objections to reparations for African-American descendants of the enslaved because, well, there's other groups, Native Americans, there is all kinds of groups, there's women that were disadvantaged. And to me, this is kind of this gets away from the real meaning of reparations. To me, it's important that it's specific to the group that was harmed in this specific way through slavery and discrimination after slavery, that doesn't mean that we can also talk about reparations, about other historical injustices for other groups. As a matter of fact, I think setting up the principle that reparations are owed for historical injustices is an important new concept that has to spread worldwide. So I think there is no contradiction between being specific about the descendants of enslaved people in the United States, African-American descendants of the enslaved or of chattel slavery, and talking about other groups as well.
I really agree with that, but I do also, unfortunately, society has to snap themselves out of always saying, "Me too." You know, when you have a group of people that have come together to find an answer to the things that were done against them decades and decades ago, that our government was involved in, and then they present something to make sure that in this case, the reparations are made, or there are some actions because of there are some actions because of what was done to people. That just means that a certain group of people got their stuff together enough to find data to prove it. Now, that doesn't mean that if there are other groups of people out there that can find data, it doesn't mean they can't do the same thing. This actually would be a blessing to them when the task force is created, and then when the federal government decides to move forward with any kind of reparations, because then it shows that there is a turnaround in our country, and that they can say, look, these kind of things happen to us also, or something similar happened to us also. And we need to start talking about how to fix that. So I hope people, instead of the smart aleck posts that people put in regards to some of the things that are posted when it comes to reparations for Blacks, and someone decides to put some comedic joke that's really negative on there, I hope that they start thinking twice about doing that, because the things that Blacks are fighting for, you know, if you were to go through the trials and tribulations that the people from back in the day, and some of us now, a majority of us now, have to put up and tolerate with, come in and take some of it off of us so you can take it away. We'd be glad to do that. And I just hope that people get in their heads that, you know, we're not fighting for this because it's a game, and we're fighting for this because there are some terrible things that went on before us. And it's time for us to try and fix that and equal out on a lot of things that are going on in our country.
Yeah, I think all of that is very important. Being specific, because there was a specific harm that was done, right? And so there needs to be a specific reparation of that harm to a specific group of people. And I think what's important to note for folks is that it does not exclude other people from seeking harm. This from seeking compensation for their harms. This can provide a framework. As a legal practitioner, when I think about, you know, like a class action lawsuit, you have to meet very specific criteria. You know, if you have a mesothelioma, you know, claim, you're not going to go over to the class action lawsuit for breast cancer or whatever it is. So, you know, although your harm is legitimate and although your harm is valid, it's not the same, right? And so I think folks have to understand that, and it only strengthens the ability to show that this is possible and this is important when it is specific and rooted back to the historical context of chattel slavery.
And I just want to chime in really quickly and say that, you know, part of the redress that we're seeking also impacts other groups in terms of addressing redlining, Jim Crow, predatory bank lending practices, housing disparities, education disparities, addressing those and making those better is going to be a benefit to all groups. And my last point is I want to remind folks that Black African Americans, especially those of us who descend from slavery, have by and large stood with Blacks across the diaspora on racial issues and justices globally. One of the modern day examples I can think of is we stood firmly with Black South Africans as they were fighting against apartheid. We organized, we put pressure, we boycotted companies and our institutions of learning, especially the HBCUs, joined together and was really fighting on our end. We stand up and fight with so many other groups. And so the pushback that I hear and get from other groups is really disheartening because we show up. And when Nelson Mandela was released from prison, we celebrated. And we didn't get anything directly from that. We support other groups in their fight for justice, and we just need folks to show up and support this for us, whether they get something directly out of it or not. Because when we win, we all are going to win, and we have to keep that in mind.
Exactly. And that is a beautiful, beautiful point. When the most marginalized in any society are strengthened, it lifts, everybody up. And so I think that is a beautiful point to mention. So I just want to quickly,
one
I'm sorry.
consideration to this thought. I agree that other groups can benefit from the reparations for African American descendants of chattel slavery, but I would also like to address the question why African American descendants of chattel slavery first, because it's an old injustice, and the longer we wait, the more the debt is accumulating exponentially. So there's actually even a good economic reason why that debt should be settled sooner rather than later. Ideally, it should have been settled in 1865, but it's better to settle it now than to wait another year or two. And so I just wanted to add that too.
Thank you. That is a very important point to make. So I just quickly to participants who are again either on Facebook Live or registered on the webinar, we are going to open up for question and answers in about 15 minutes. So start thinking about some questions that you may want to ask our panelists. In addition, there is going to be a poll for the viewers, just getting some of your feedback on overall your feedback on the panel and specifically on the proposed bill that we are discussing tonight. So let's think, we're a couple of years in the future. The bill has passed into law. The task force is established. They've studied, they've come up with this beautiful report that's data-driven and actionable. What does that look like locally? What does that mean for our state? And then what would you want to see in terms of a comprehensive reparations package at the national level? Pie in the sky ideas, what is this going to do?
I think that it's going to be one of those actions speak louder than words kind of things. Ensuring that there's a huge change to even education funding from the federal government. The healthcare system has to change to make sure that folk aren't having to decide between buying a loaf of bread or going to get some kind of medical help that is necessary, or not going to get the medical help because they know they can't afford it. There has to be some drastic changes from the federal government in regards to monetary, health, education. It really has to be some big movement of things to make sure that equality has been issued out.
So from my standpoint, a federal reparations bill, first and foremost, must include cash direct payments to the descendants of slavery, U.S. slavery. The wraparound programming that State Rep Nolan is talking about will be in addition to, will be on top of, but does not replace direct cash payment to the descendants of slavery. From there, what that looks like will be decided within our families, within our groups. The idea that we need to ration or manage the money that is coming to the reparations that is owed is not something I'm in favor of. I think that we are quite capable of managing money on our own and deciding what we want to do. And that includes whether it's starting businesses or buying a home or paying off your student loans or whatever other expenses or not. It's really up to that individual. I'm also looking for, again, the specific designation as a group on census, on any U.S. documentation that we're counting people. That is important, and we need to move expediently. We cannot allow this to languish any longer. It's been sitting on the shelves of Congress for over 30 years. We need to move quickly. So a task force at the federal level should be formed, given a timeline to complete their work. Participants or task force members should not be paid exorbitant amount of money to do this work. They should be doing it because they're bringing in a level of expertise and knowledge and are working to right this wrong. It should not be a money grab for individuals to be on this task force. So those are like the main highlights that I'm looking for. And then of course the wraparound programs and actions and policies that can take on top of that is what I'm looking for.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, if I'm thinking about a pie in the sky, there is this one part of the Connecticut bill that I really like is the fact that Connecticut would push the federal government to pass HR 40 or pass reparations. HR 40, the House bill in the US House of Representatives, also only consider setting up a task force as well, a commission to study reparations. And I would say it's, this has been in the House since 1989. And since then, a lot of research has been done. So a lot of the work of that commission has actually already been done by people like Professor Darity and by Professor Richard F. America in his pioneering volume, The Wealth of Races of 1990. So a lot of research has been done. So it's time, I think, to move to actual reparations. So part of that bill should be actual reparations, and then an initial payment maybe, and then further payments can be researched and determined later. But I think it's time to move to actual reparations.
I agree. I think if I can, even on the moderator, weigh in a little bit, because this this issue is the critical issue of our time, particularly when we're seeing the potential of this gap widening and getting even greater in light of COVID and in light of the enormous wealth transfer that Seanice talked about earlier. Much of the research has been done by brilliant minds such as yourself and Dr. Darity, who was here earlier. Large institutions have invested tons of money to research this issue. And so I certainly don't want to see that part of it belabored. I think we do need to get to the actual doling out of the compensation, of the actual reparations. And I also think there needs to be, I also think it will symbolize, but it will be a final acknowledgement of this original sin of United States on a national level. It will probably require a rewriting history, of the history books, of the way that we teach American history to our children. I think a lot of that work will have to be done to repair some of the damage as well. And so, but definitely the cash payments, I think it's well past time. As you say, the debt just continues to accrue. And so that is where we are. So what is, before we open it up to the question and answer, my last question is, what is the critical bold next step that we need to take here in Connecticut? What are your next steps with respect to continuing to advocate for this bill, educating our general public, and getting the support that is going to be required in order to make this a reality? What can we do at home in all of our respective spaces that we, and tables that we sit at? What is our call to action at this juncture?
I think you hit it in what you said. Biggest thing is educating people to understand and to try and reach out to in our different communities to try and get to those who question or those who need to learn more about it, because that is going to be a big door closer when we talk about it. And it might be just doing some kind of similar Zooms where we just have open discussion about it, where people can just watch it at their leisure, to make sure that they understand what the discussion is, instead of guessing all the time, or instead of hearing or seeing some of the things that people put that are not true out there in regards to it. I really push people to talk to your legislators and get your legislators on board to make sure that they understand how big this is. Like I said before, you've seen what happened over the summer in regards to the concerns that people had. Well, this is big enough to be the same kind of concern in regards to reparations. We really need to talk to our legislators, because a lot of our legislators might not truly understand. As I told you when I first started talking to Seanice, I didn't have a great deal of clarity. I had a brief, a small understanding, but in deeper talks, my eyes were opened, and that's what has to be done to a lot more people. So, that's what I think right now.
So if I can chime in as well, I would love, because I don't want us to close this session without bringing this up on the screen. I want to share with the audience the net worth, that chart, if someone can bring that up, because this is what we're dealing with right here. This is the median net worth chart here in America. And we see where Black people fall in on this chart. We have to dispel the myths that we have about ourselves, and that others have about us. We really need to use data. The next big bold step is how we politicize around this issue, how we vote around this issue. This needs to be our primary driving issue as we are voting and making decisions about who we're voting for. We need to all galvanize around this together, because this is the only way that this will happen. We can bring the image down. So again, we need to, here in Connecticut, talk to our legislatures, galvanize around this issue in terms of our voting, and really talk about this at home. This should be a part of the normal conversations that we're having, because it impacts everything in this country. We live in a capitalistic society. Economics is the main driver to address the disparities that we see today. It's all surrounding economics. When we think about housing disparities, education disparities, business, income, all of that is driven by economics, and that needs to be our focus. And I think, you know, as Black people, we focused on too many other things, and we put other things before our needs. I think we need to really hone in on this, and put all of our efforts and energy on a political level toward this. This is what's been driving me. I'm not a political activist. This not where I came from. But over the past year, my eyes have been open, and one of the great things that has happened with COVID is it gave people time to pay attention. And you start to pay attention, you're like, wait a minute. And you start to look at the data. And so I've gotten tunnel vision with this, and people who know me will tell you that. But I think it's so important, and I want others to be engaged. We need to make this our driving force, political force, moving forward.
Definitely agree.
And as a bold next step, I also think that we have to start thinking what comes after the task force and the report, to make sure that the report is not collecting dust, that new legislation is prepared for Connecticut to actually act on those things that it can do to narrow the wealth gap in Connecticut and take care of the other issues, and then to pressure the federal government to actually provide reparations and hopefully neutralize the wealth gap in the near future, not in the far future, but in the near future.
Definitely, definitely.
I think it's funny that it's actually funny that you said that, because the other day Seanice and I was talking, and I said, "Are you ready for what's next?" and, because that's how quick you have to run with things, especially with the politics part of it. You know, once we accomplish this, there has to be something that comes right after it. It just can't go dead. It needs to, you almost have to prepare stuff as if you're ready next year already. You know, and that's the kind of movement we need to have when it comes to this. So that was a good answer.
Definitely. So I'm going to turn now, if you all don't mind, to some of the questions that are in the Q&A. Okay. So I have a specific question directly to Representative Nolan, and it really talks about one of the points that were talked about earlier with Seanice saying, you know, as the bill is written, as the proposal is written, we don't want it diluted. And so the question from James is, how will you monitor and maintain the integrity of the proposal and bill to its fruition and execution? So essentially making sure it doesn't get watered down and diluted. And this kind of picks up on some of the other questions that were asked, because folks do have that concern, which is legitimate.
And that is actually a serious concern, because once you submit a bill, sometimes you get to have input as submitted, because there's so many tweaks done to it to get it to a point where they can say that they just passed a bill. And so I have to be on my toes, and I have to ask others to stay on their toes in regards to what information goes into it and what information comes out of it. And I will need assistance to do that. That is something I won't be able to do on my own, and I'm not scared to say that, because it takes the people to make sure that the bill structure stands strong as it is, and if there is additions to it, that it benefits the bill, it doesn't take away from the bill. So, you know, that's going to be something to really pay attention to, and you know, and I don't mind people holding my feet to the fire in regards to it, and I'm not worried about nobody doing that, because I know Seanice is going to do it, even if she does it alone. But you know, it's going to take more than me to make sure that the structure of the bill stands strong.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. So there's two questions that are similar, and it goes to this idea of yet another study. Why do we as Black Americans need a study when other groups didn't have as much and still got reparations? And then a similar question, Connecticut has a pattern of pulling task force together, usually resulting in diluting the issues. What specifically would the task force yield?
We have to make sure that the people that are on the task force are able to do the historic research and are educated enough to make sure that what we are seeking is the main points of the task that they're at. Because if not, if we allow them to put anybody on the task force that they deem that they deem is okay, but we know is not okay. It's almost like a checks and balances. So I think as the bill is put together, we have to really determine the historians and or the educators that need to be in that task force, so that we make sure it's done right. And I'm sorry, I forgot the other part of your question.
The question was, what specifically would the task force yield? So what is the ultimate, I guess, product, the tangible of the task force?
As far as I'm not sure if they mean the information from the bill.
So the task force will create a proposal. The proposal, so they're going to give their recommendations to the state of Connecticut on the 12 items that we shared on the screen earlier about how to address those disparities. It will also advocate at the federal level for federal reparations. Like, this is going to be our push, our statement to our legislatures at the federal level to say Connecticut is backing federal reparations. Here's what our study has found, and this is why it needs to happen. And then obviously the name designation, as African American descendants of slaves, being something that we're enumerating. So that's kind of the quick overview of what the task force will look to do. I want to kind of get back to why a task force, and two things I want to share. We were very much aware when we put the proposal together of how to comprise the task force, who will be on it. And we wanted to be very clear that it was not going to be solely academics or historians. We want real people on the task force so that we're hearing from those of us who descend from slavery need to be on that task force. We need to be on the majority on that task force, because no one can tell our story better than us. And so while we will have the academics, the historians, the researchers on it, our story needs to be told by us, which is very, very, doesn't happen very often. So that's number one. And so we outlined in that 10-page proposal some very specifics around how that task force would be designed, how we're recommending that task force is designed. And then the last thing I wanted, there was one more item that I wanted to address regarding the task force. And I lost train of thought, but it looks like, Professor Craemer, you had something you wanted to add as I was talking? Maybe.
Well, I was looking through the question and answers. I'm sorry. So I'm not prepared to add this.
That's okay. I was just trying to give myself a minute to think. That's basically the answers regarding the task force. So if there's another question.
We talked a little bit about this in one of our planning meetings with respect to the insurance companies and their role in slave trade. And obviously we are in Hartford. This is the insurance capital of the world. And so how do we envision assessing insurance companies in this work? And how will they atone in this moment, given that we are starting, even though we're not asking Connecticut specifically as a state to pay reparations, these are national companies, national conglomerates that had a huge role in slavery.
I think it goes along with what we are saying that we want the government to do for us. These insurance companies have billions of dollars, and I think that there ought to be some investment from them also in regards to their part that they took in regards to how they treated our folk and how they shifted folk around. It is very reasonable to ask for, I believe, because of how deep they were involved in some of the atrocities, I will call it, that went on. That was that is another bill that I had actually put in, because there is insurance companies are using credit reports to determine the rates of insurance of our folk. And we know some of the hardships that we have with our credit. And we know that people of color have a history of having issues with credit when we grow up, and our parents accidentally use our number sometimes to do things. So we're trying to get insurance companies to stop using credit to determine how much the rate on insurance for cars are going to be. It has nothing to do with driving. But that's a small piece of some of the legislation that we're putting in. But on a bigger scale, they got enough money, I think, to take share and pay back also.
Go ahead, Dr. Craemer.
Yeah, I think thank you. The idea that corporations and organizations that were implicated in either the slave trade or slavery, or that profited from dealing with the southern states and built large, companies out of that are operating today. There's a precedent for how these companies could be engaged in paying reparations. In my native Germany, for example, there was an organization founded by the government in conjunction with German companies that benefited from slave labor during World War II, that paid into a common fund that was then distributed to the eligible recipients of reparations payments. So something like that is a model that could work in Connecticut as well. It could work on the federal level as well. And this is also where the usefulness of a task force comes in, to actually do the research on, or compile the research on what companies were there at the time benefiting. So I think that's really a great question.
Yeah, it definitely is. And when I think about, how the task force is going to be, organized and who is going to be on it, certainly I agree with Seanice's point about it being, dominated by the people directly affected by this issue. However, I do think it's important to start building relationships now with those who were complicit in this and are right here in the state. And we think about some of our major institutions, Yale, in the insurance companies, to start getting that buy-in early, I think is going to make this a much more powerful movement. So I appreciate you bringing that example, Dr. Craemer. We talked a little bit about this too. I believe Tony is the one who brought this up about disaggregating the data, specifically when it comes to being able to identify those who are, Black descendants of slavery, vis-a-vis those who are with foreign-born heritage. So does anybody have any thoughts about how we're gonna start being able to do that?
Are you saying in terms of once the task force is formed and they're starting to analyze the data, or you mean as a part of the enumeration process? Some of these.
Probably a little bit of both, because I guess on the back end, once once the historical and the research is done, it's going to be boiled down to who is ultimately going to get the compensation. But when we look at figuring out a monetary amount about that harm, I think it gets a little bit trickier to say, okay, if you are Caribbean and Black descendant of slavery, African American slavery, how do you start to really parse that out? I think becomes a little bit more confusing. So I don't know if anyone has any thoughts about how that process would take place in disaggregating that data.
I think for this question, it would be really useful if Professor Darity was still here. Because he and Kirsten Nolan laid out in their book what the eligibility criteria would be. And if I remember correctly, it would be anybody who has any ancestry among people that were enslaved in the United States and identified as African American or Black for the past 12 years, I believe it says in the book. So the idea is there, and I don't know if I'm projecting this onto this proposal, but there is a large number of white Americans that actually do have slave ancestry without knowing about it, and it would be a huge windfall if they could gain from the reparations if it was just determined through ancestry. So the idea is to have that requirement that you have on some government document identified as Black or African American or Afro-American or whatever the designation might be, or Negro in the olden days. I think it doesn't need to be disaggregated any further and split about parents, or I think it's just important, if I understand Professor Darity correctly, that there be some direct connection to enslaved people in the United States. And Seanice, I don't know if I understood this correctly, so please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah,
You're right on. You're right on point with it. The process is twofold. You need to be descendant from have some connection to an ancestor who was enslaved here in America. And then the second piece is that you would need to identify the document that is being brought on the screen says at least 10 to 12 years demonstrate that you've been identified as Black, African American, Negro, etc. So that's the twofold process. The other question that we often get regarding that is, well, how do we know if we have a slave ancestor? And my answer to that always is, one of the great things about America is it kept records. We have census records that go back. So if we look at the 1870 census, which is the first census after the emancipation, they counted people. And so they counted the freedmen. So it would just be a matter of one family group can identify themselves as being connected to a slave, and that pretty much does your whole family. So every individual person doesn't necessarily have to prove that connection themselves. It'll kind of snowball almost, and then obviously meet the second criteria. Because even within my own family, we have whites that have we have relatives that were Black and passed as white, and so they would not meet the criteria because they have not identified as Black, in the last 10, 12 years, and much longer, obviously. So that's the twofold process. But the beauty of it is we can refine those things, but that's what we're working with. I think it's a great way to identify that will capture 99.99% of the people. Oh, here's the other piece that I wanted to make. The other point I wanted to make. We were talking about why a task force. So I sat in on a call or a meeting with the descendants of those who received reparations from the Japanese internment. And one of the things that I learned, which was very enlightening to me, was that they, for their reparations, they had a task force. And they were not happy about that initially. They were like, oh man, why we need a task force? Because we already know what happened. But the task force is very, very important because it outlines the proposal. It lays out the steps. So then if we don't have a task force, we'll be sitting around in this group trying to figure out what to do. The task force's job is to lay out the framework. That's why they're so important. And they give the proposal to Congress on how we can proceed with the business of doing the reparation. So it's not a negative thing. We need to have the task force. We need to get on board with that. The issue is we need to make sure that the task force does its work, not having the task force, making sure the task force is doing their work and is very focused in meeting our needs.
I think an additional thing that the task force could do is take that requirement that African Americans research their own family trees at their own expense off the shoulders of the eligible recipients, and say the government itself, as part of a reparations program, could pay professional genealogists to do that work that Seanice was laying out, which is basically the wrinkle, I think, in this is that in 1816, the last census before the Civil War, the enslaved were not listed by name, only by head. So anybody who was not listed, and free blacks were listed by name. So anybody who is listed as black or mulatto in the 1870 census and did not show up in the 1816 census can be presumed to have been enslaved. So there are ways how genealogists can go about it. And it would be an easy thing for the government to fund research in that and establish the eligibility criteria.
Excellent point, and the power of modern science helps with that. And I'll definitely thank my beautiful and brilliant cousin Seanice, because she has traced our family's lineage back. So I know we're good to go when it comes to getting our reparations. Another question, and this is a really good question, something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. In Connecticut, less than 5% of public leaders, town managers, mayors, board of education, town council, etc., are Black and brown. What would be your recommendations to address systemic racism in these spaces so as to address this bill in our state? So this really goes, about what we were talking about before, political power, and the fact that we are, underrepresented in so many areas, but it's particularly the political space. Obviously, this is a brilliant example of, an everyday resident getting involved and really leading something that is historical. And so, Seanice, what would you say, and anybody on the panel, to those who want to be more involved in the political space and get civically engaged, and how could this task force potentially help with that?
I think maybe it's all about activism, getting out there and spreading your wings to let your mouth do the talking, as far as for the things that you think that need to be broken up, that haven't been broken up, or the things that are taking too long to break up. In regards to the political arena, we all know that some of the major reasons why Blacks aren't put in legislation or elected as much as whites is because there's a controlling factor in there. And it's not a cheap shot to anybody. It's just a fact. There's a controlling factor, and the way to make that change is people have to get, first, Black folk need to set themselves up to be elected. And then Black folk need to come out and vote. That is the only way that we are going to turn around the system. That is one of the biggest ways that we can make sure that equality happens. And, there's going to be a lot of people out there that aren't going to want that to happen. They brought us over here from other places, and now they're stuck with us. And the problem is now things have to become equal, and that's just factual.
Yeah, and to add to that, I would also say in politics, it's important that, how lobbying is done. So of course, that goes to the question again of net worth and of money that's around. And so reparations could be very helpful in equaling the playing field when it comes to the actual lobbying. So that's another consideration why reparations are useful.
And then my last comment regarding this is, not only do we need to vote, we need to be intentional with our vote. Because oftentimes we talk about telling Black folks that we need to vote, but I think it goes further than that. We need to know who we're voting for. We need to recognize that our vote is an exchange and it's not a gift. We need to demand specific policies that impact us, and we have to be willing to make the sacrifice that if that individual that is running and wants our vote, they will not get it. I do not care if they are Democrat. I do not care if they are Black. We have to start being intentional about how we're using our vote, and we need to vote as a block. We need to vote as a collective group, define what our issues are, and really, that's how our vote carries weight, when we join together in collectivism. So I will say that. And my last comment is, I'm an introvert. So, but I've surrounded myself with some great, great people that challenge me, that push me to do things that I may not want to do. And so I appreciate that. Expand your circle, step out of your comfort zone, do things that you may not feel the most comfortable doing. So those of you that are listening, if you think that you want to get involved, jump in. We need your help. Get with organizations and get with groups that represent, what you're looking for and what you would like to see happen.
Definitely. Another question for Representative Nolan. What education, and this could be, for anyone too, what education incentives or initiatives, I think, were launched to prepare the masses for educating around this issue of reparations? So I think this speaks to, how are we getting this information to the public? Obviously, this panel today, but what are some of the next steps that are going to take place immediately after this panel to ensuring that our communities can, as you were saying in the beginning, use their voices to rally and champion this bill?
It's got to be a word of mouth. It's got to be individuals spreading it around. I know Seanice and I talked about trying to put some videos together. Definitely some more town hall type discussions. Maybe spreading literature around. It might even be beneficial for us to do a class of some sort on reparations to make sure that people truly understand what it is. I know I can be educated a lot more in it, but I think the basics, and I know in the draft that Seanice sent me, it shows the definition. That is something that, I think maybe we need to push out a little bit more in different animated type literature that people are able to understand.
Yeah, I think there needs to definitely be a common message around this issue, because when I think about some of the things that the legislator has done, like racial impact statements, whenever a proposal or a proposed policy or legislation is going to be brought up, you know, I don't, now knowing what I know now, and once people know the enormity of and how deeply rooted this issue is, you can't talk about justice, inequality, in racial parity, in economic parity in this state, in this country, without talking about reparations. You just, I don't see how, once you know about it, how you cannot mention that, like how you cannot mention reparations when you say, you know, Black and white have a huge education and learning gap. Black and white have huge disparities in employment. Black and white have huge disparities in health outcomes. You can't, in good conscience, make any of those statements and not talk about reparations. I just don't see how you can do it going forward. And so I think as much as we can continue to repeat that message and make sure our politicians and the powers that be really understand that anything you say, I can't even think is legitimate if you aren't talking about reparations and how we get it done.
Yeah. I think it's important, especially for legislators, to understand, and it might be something that I need to do, is to make sure that I pass around at least the detailed definitions of what reparations is, because like I said, there's going to be people that sign on to parts of this, and not just Connecticut legislators, but in federal legislators, because they know, just because of how Blacks have been treated, that once they hear just a little bit about it, that they're going to automatically say, yeah, I'm going to sign on to it. And that's okay. We'll take the signature. But at the same time, it's ideal for legislators to have that discussion, because they have so many people that look at them for how the state functions, you know. So I think legislators need to really know a little bit more about it, you know, just to be able to explain to residents and communities their take on it, and be specific. It's yeah, I signed on to it. Okay, why? What do you know about it? You know, what can you tell us about it? You know, that kind of thing.
There's a lot of literature and information already available from reputable sources, from educators and researchers and grassroots organizations. I don't think that there isn't enough information on there. I just think that we just need to help people realize that this is important. And once they realize that it is important, the information is there and we can, you know, channel that. That's one of the nice things about the Political Action CT Facebook page. And we'll start to branch out into other social media platforms. But what we're doing is we're compiling a lot of the information into one public site. And the other great thing about about our group is we are working with a wide variety of groups. We are willing to, the end goal is what we're looking for. We're not focused on needing to be a part of this group or that group. We just really want like-minded people that want the same end goal. And so, you know, follow us on our page. Coming up next, we have a meeting with the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus on February 23rd. So that's next week. We'll be sharing the proposal and pressing the legislatures hard on why they need to pass this bill as is, intact, as suggested in the proposal. We will be having, hopefully, hearings. We'll be trying to strategize on how we can get on the calendar for hearings so that the public can have their voices heard. We have a Google form that is circulating now that's on the Political Action CT page. where we're gathering signatures and getting feedback from Connecticut constituents, people that are here, so that they can share their thoughts on the bill that's out there. So, and we're going to be presenting that. And so the press is on. We need a full court press from everyone. And so that's like next steps. That's what everyone can do moving forward.
Excellent, thank you. We have someone in the audience who has their hand raised, so I'm going to hopefully allow them to ask their question. Mr. Williams?
Sorry about that. My hand was raised by accident, I believe. Sorry about that, guys.
We can hear you, but it sounded a little muffled. So if you want to speak up louder, or if you want to type your question, I can ask it for you.
No, I was apologizing. I was saying I hit the raise your hand button by accident. I was just listening. I apologize about that.
Oh, no worries, no worries. Thank you for being here with us. So one other question, and this is a political question, but probably anybody can answer it. So the Democratic Party is usually, the ones proponents behind social justice initiatives and anything that involves, Black people mostly. But this is an American issue. This really isn't a party issue. And so how do you envision getting bipartisan support for, locally, obviously for the task force, but then nationally? Obviously we are in probably a critical time where Democrats, have the majority of the political power right now. So I think if any time to do it is now, but obviously we want people to, going back to Seanice's point, the importance has to be felt by everybody, by the masses. So how do you envision getting bipartisan support for something like this?
I know for me, it takes me, and I hate to say it because there shouldn't be one, but crossing the line to have the discussion and to start out talking with those that are friendly and hope those that are friendly will have the further discussion with those who might struggle to acknowledge and also struggle to support. I don't think it's difficult to have the discussion. It's just a matter of kicking feet to do it. I think that we have the ears of those that you might think don't want to listen. But again, it's education, it's understanding, and it's making that connection with them or sharing the similarities and the ways that Blacks are affected from some of the policies, showing some of the examples of some of the policies that we have now that are historically part of the problem.
Did you have anything you wanted to add? Go. Okay, Dr. Craemer, go.
Sorry, I could also imagine that it's actually not too hard to make a point that to conservative listeners or to conservative politicians, that reparations is not per se a liberal policy proposal in its structure. Liberal policy proposals are much more common that they benefit everybody or benefit the poor, and then it disproportionately benefits descendants of the enslaved, but not reparations necessarily. There were a couple of proposals floating around like that. I think it's important to remember that one of the earliest people in the mainstream that supported reparations was Charles Krauthammer, a conservative commentator, who basically felt he was opposed to affirmative action into other pro-Black policies because he felt it was racialized and whatnot. But he favored reparations as something that's obvious and clear. There was an unfair, there was a historical injustice. It needs to be repaired. and reparations is the way to go. So he literally proposed a lump sum payment. So that's a conservative. And what also strikes me as conservative about reparations is that it is about merit. It's about who did the work, who should benefit from hard work, whose heirs should the benefits go to. And so I think there is a way to talk about reparations across party lines and across ideological divides. So it's just one thought.
Excellent point. Thank you. Seanice, did you have anything to add to this point about bipartisan support?
I just want to remind people, excuse me, that we have to do politics regardless of who is in office. And while I do believe that Democrats should champion this proposal or reparations, we need everyone. We need to press every politician on this topic. And we need to remember that it was a Republican that actually signed the reparations for the Japanese Americans. And they did not think that they were going to receive reparations either. So again, we have to move away from the idea that it's either Democrat or Republican. We need to be sure that we are addressing this with both parties. The other thing, and the reason why I say Democrats need to champion it is because that's the part where they're based. So that is where we're voting. Black people voted this election, 93% Black women and 86% Black men voted for the Biden-Harris ticket. They need to be more direct in their support of reparations for Black American descendants of slavery, and they need to get it done. It can be done in the 4 years that they're in office. It can be done within the 2 year before the midterm elections. They can do it. And as Biden said during the debate, he said that we can walk and chew gum. So I know that we're in a pandemic and we're in a crisis, but we can walk and chew gum. And he needs to get it done. They need to get it done.
Thank you. And that is a great way to end with our call to action. Let's get it done here locally. Please, for everybody who has joined us tonight, thank you so much for your engagement. Please continue to stay engaged in this issue. This is a historical moment. This is the issue, the civil rights, the social justice issue of our modern day. This is history in the making. So I thank you to all of our panelists who added their insight, their expertise, their passion, and their commitment to ensuring that we do get this done, specifically here in Connecticut with the passing of the bill that is proposed, 6267. Representative Nolan, thank you so much for being one of the main sponsors. Seanice, thank you for your commitment. Dr. Craemer, thank you so much for adding the historical and the research aspect and continuing to stay and be one of the leaders in this space. Dr. Darity, who I know had to leave early, we definitely appreciated his insight. And thank you to everybody behind the scenes who is working very, very hard on this issue. Mr. Bryant, Ms. Edwards, Sabrina Tucker, and Tony Blunt as well. So again, just stay engaged. I think Sabrina added the page, the CT PAC page. Please stay engaged on that page. There'll be a lot more coming up. We have the Black and Hispanic caucus meeting on 2/23, where they'll be presenting what the task force is going to be charged with. And please continue to stay engaged. This issue is ever, ever important and ever pressing right now. So again, we thank you for joining us this evening. And I know that I am fired up about this and just so proud of you, Seanice, for your leadership in this space. This is amazing. And I just can't wait to see what's ultimately going to transpire as a result of your leadership. So Thank you, everyone, and have a safe and good night.